I don't know why I said it. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe I'd spent too many years using humor to cover what I couldn't say straight. She was crouched over the board, holding my DeWalt drill, the yellow and black one, holding it like she'd done it 100 times. I was pressing the board flat, staring at the plans I wasn't reading. My mouth opened. At this rate you'll never get married, Callie. You spend every Saturday fixing a neighbor's house. She looked up, not quickly, really looked. Then she smiled, a smile I'd never seen before, something patient behind it. Then maybe you're the reason. The drill was still running. I didn't breathe. I didn't know where to put my hands. My name is Daniel Rowe. I'm 38 years old, freelance carpenter, based out of Providence, Rhode Island, the kind of city where the winters stretch longer than they have any right to, and the neighbors are polite enough not to ask more than they need to. That suits me fine. I've always been comfortable in places where people leave each other alone and let the work speak for itself. I bought the house 3 years ago, just after I turned 35. The reason I bought it was honest, if not romantic. It needed a lot of work, and I needed something to do with my hands. That was the whole calculation. The house had been sitting empty for about 14 months. You could see it in the paint, in the porch boards, in the way the kitchen faucet leaked just enough to be a problem without being an emergency. I moved in with a truck bed full of tools and a half-finished list of repairs, and I've been working through it ever since. Slowly, imperfectly. The way I do most things. I've never been married. I've never been close to it in the way that leaves a visible scar. There were relationships, a couple of them serious enough, that the question of the future came up, was circled around, was implied in the way someone starts leaving things at your place, or asking about your schedule 3 weeks out. And every time that happened, every time I could feel a conversation coming before it arrived, I found a way to step back. A project that needed my full attention, a lease ending at a convenient time. Some version of the story where distance made more sense than staying put. I'm not proud of that pattern. I'm telling you because it's the true answer to the question people always seem to want to ask when they find out I'm 38 and live alone in a house I'm renovating by myself. The deck in the backyard is the clearest evidence of that particular flaw. I drew the plans 2 years before I cut the first board. I bought the lumber good stuff, pressure-treated pine, more than I needed, and stacked it in the corner of my workshop under a canvas tarp. And every morning I'd pour my coffee into the cracked mug I've been meaning to replace for 18 months, stand at the kitchen window, and look out at the stacked wood and think, this is the week I start. And then the week would end, and I hadn't started. The workshop is attached to the back of the house through a door off the mudroom. It smells like sawdust and machine oil, and faintly like the pine boards curing in the corner. There's an AM radio on the shelf above the workbench that gets 2 stations clearly and a third only when the weather turns cold. In the morning I turn it on low and it plays whatever it plays, talk, country, classical. I'm not particular. And I drink my coffee and look at whatever I'm working on. The cracked mug has been there for over a year. I've walked past better mugs in stores. I don't know why I haven't replaced it. Some things you just keep. Callie Brooks moved into the house 2 doors down in April. I saw her for the first time when I was unloading a run of timber from my truck. She was standing on the sidewalk watching, and the way she was looking at the truck wasn't curious, neighbor watching. It was assessment. Weight distribution, load balance, the kind of reading you do when you've thought about structural load your whole professional life. Did you chalk the wheels? She asked. I had not chalked the wheels. I went and chalked the wheels without saying anything. She was a structural engineer, 34 years old, also single, also living alone. I learned this gradually, the way you learn things about the people near you when you're both outside at the same hours, and neither of you is avoiding conversation. We were nothing at first. 2 people on the same block who nodded when they crossed paths, exchanged 10 words about the weather or the parking on Saturdays. Normal neighbor distance. I wasn't looking for anything more than that. I bought the DeWalt when I first moved in. It was the first thing I brought inside before the furniture, before the boxes. Something deliberate about that, or I meant it to be. A tool before everything else. A promise to myself that I was going to be the kind of person who fixed what needed fixing and built what needed building, and didn't let things sit unfinished. I'd kept parts of that promise. The faucet got fixed. The porch boards got replaced. The deck plans sat in the drawer for 2 years. She knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, Maybe 6 weeks after she'd moved in, her drill was at the service center under warranty, and she needed to hang some shelving before a furniture delivery on Friday. Could she borrow mine? I said yes, without hesitating. She thanked me, took the drill, and was back down the sidewalk before the screen door had finished swinging shut. The whole thing took under a minute. There was nothing notable about it except that she knew exactly what she needed and didn't make it complicated. She brought the drill back that same evening, and when she knocked on the door, she had a loaf of zucchini bread in her other hand, wrapped in brown parchment paper and tied with kitchen twine. "I baked too much," she said. "If you don't like zucchini, just throw it out." She was already turning to leave when she said it like the bread was an afterthought, like she hadn't thought much about it. I thanked her, and she walked back down the street. I ate the entire loaf that night, standing at the kitchen counter, tearing pieces off, not even sitting down. It was good bread. But it wasn't the bread I was thinking about while I ate it. About 10 days later, I was in the backyard wrestling with a problem that genuinely requires 2 people, or at minimum, a proper set of clamps holding a board in position while driving a screw into the end of it at an angle. I was managing it, more or less, but not gracefully. I heard footsteps on the gravel path that runs along the side of the house and looked up. Callie was standing at the edge of the yard. She watched me for maybe 10 full seconds, taking in the situation. "I can hold the other end for you, if that would help," she said. We worked for 3 hours. She didn't need instruction. She knew which side of the board to stand on, when to shift her grip, how to read where I was going with the next piece, before I said anything. We worked in a rhythm that took about 20 minutes to establish, and then just continued. And the silence between us wasn't the kind that needs to be filled. That's rarer than people think. Silence between 2 people who don't know each other well usually carries some weight. Someone's waiting for someone to say the right thing, or feeling the pressure of the quiet and looking for a way out of it. With Callie, the silence was just the sound of work getting done. It didn't ask anything of me. The following week it rained, one of those Providence summer rains that arrives without any warning and dumps everything it has in about 20 minutes. She was at the edge of the yard when it started, helping me check a measurement, and there was nowhere to go but inside. I brought her into the workshop. I offered coffee, and she noticed the packet of tea on the shelf, something my friend Marcus had left behind months ago, and I'd never gotten around to throwing out, and asked if she could have that instead. I made the tea without comment. We sat in the workshop listening to the rain hit the tin roof while the yard turned to mud outside. She told me about the bridge project she was consulting on, a pedestrian bridge over the Woonasquatucket that needed a complete deck rehabilitation, the kind of work where the engineering has to account for not just current load, but 50 years of load to come. I told her about the first dining table I ever built professionally, how one leg came out a 1/4 inch short, how I offered to rebuild it and the client turned me down. She said she liked the wobble, I told her, said it made the table feel honest. Callie laughed at that, not the laugh you give someone to be polite, but the laugh that means something actually landed. The real version. I noticed the difference. Somewhere in the 5th week I started buying better coffee. Whole beans instead of the pre-ground canister I'd been using for 2 years. I went to the specialty place on Atwells Avenue that I'd driven past a dozen times without stopping. I didn't ask myself why I was doing it. I just started doing it. I also started working on Saturday mornings instead of Sunday mornings. My schedule is flexible. I set my own hours. I work around client deadlines. I can move things around. There was no practical reason to prefer Saturdays, except that Callie tended to walk past on Saturdays. On Sundays, she was usually gone by the time I got started. I didn't connect those 2 things in any deliberate way. I truly did not think about it consciously, but my hands and my feet apparently had it figured out before my brain did. One Saturday in July, she came into the workshop while I was sorting fasteners, and sat down at the edge of the workbench. The deck plans were spread out. I'd been looking at them again, thinking about the railing design. She pulled them toward her and studied them. She read drawings the way people in her field read them, following the logic of the structure, understanding the sequence. She traced the main beam line with her index finger, slow and careful, and she didn't correct anything, didn't point out what I might have done differently. She just looked. Then she said, "What do you want it to look like when it's done?" I told her about the board width I'd chosen, the grain direction, the style of railing, a simple horizontal cable design, minimal. Nothing that would fight with the view of the yard. I talked about it for a while, explaining the choices. Anyone hearing this story right now almost certainly understands what she was actually asking. I answered the question about the deck, and then came that Saturday. Late July, and the light was already doing that early August thing, coming in flat and golden. The kind of light that makes everything look like it's already remembered. She was using my drill, crouched over the board, both hands on it, hair up with pieces loose at her face. I was on the far end, pressing the board down, looking at the plans. I hadn't read a word of them in 10 minutes. I said it without deciding to say it. At this rate you'll never get married, Callie. You spend every Saturday fixing a neighbor's house. I meant it the way I always meant things I was afraid of, as a joke, holding it at arm's length. She looked up. Not quickly, not defensively. She just looked at me. And then she smiled, that smile that had something behind it, something patient that had been waiting for a long time. She said, "Then maybe you're the reason." The drill was still running in her hand. I stood there holding a board I wasn't holding anymore, just resting my hands on it because I needed somewhere to put them. I didn't have a response. I didn't have a thought. There was just a long second where the yard was very still, and the drill was running and I was not breathing. She finished the screw she was driving and handed me the drill when she left that evening, same as always, thanked me, short and easy, and walked back down the street. I stood in the doorway watching her go, same as I'd stood there a dozen times before, except this time I knew why I was standing there. I went into the workshop and sat in the dark. The drill was on the work table where she'd set it. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there and tried to figure out what I was feeling. I've never been good at that particular task. Naming things, saying what something actually is, instead of describing it around the edges. What I knew was this. It was the first time I'd looked at the drill and not thought about work. I thought about the way her hands held it, certain and easy, and without any of the hesitation that lives in almost everything I do. And what scared me, what I sat with in the dark for a long time, was that the thought of it made me feel something good, not complicated, just good. And good things have always made me nervous. Garrett Webb sent me a text on a Wednesday evening in early August. In Providence for 2 weeks, consulting gig. Beer? Garrett and I had been close, once close the way you get with people who knew you before you'd assembled a version of yourself to show the world. We'd grown apart geographically over the years, not emotionally, which meant a 9-month gap in contact cost nothing when we finally sat down together. He was good at that. He always had been. We met at a place on Wickenden Street, low light. Good draft list. The kind of bar that's been there long enough that the stools fit the floor. He looked settled. Married 4 years. A daughter who just turned 2. The specific tiredness of someone investing in something real. We ordered, caught up on the surface of things, and then he asked what was new with me. I told him about the deck project. Somewhere in the telling, I started talking about Callie. I was trying to describe it as a neighbor situation, a practical arrangement, someone helpful and technically skilled who had been contributing to a home improvement project. I was choosing words carefully, and I could hear myself doing it, which should have been a warning. Garrett watched me for a while, with the expression I remembered from when we were 26, and I was explaining, at some length, why some woman I clearly had feelings for was someone I spent a lot of time with but didn't think about that way. "You like her," he said. "Not a question. Flat. She's been a good neighbor." "Daniel," he set his beer on the bar. "You've been talking about her for 12 minutes, uninterrupted. Without being asked to continue, I started to say something and he kept going. "Do you remember Sarah? The one from Portland, the architect. You talked about her for months as your good friend, right up until the day she took that job in Seattle. And then you spent 6 months being quietly upset about it, and you never once reached out to her. Because calling her would have made it real, and real things have always been the thing you can't quite handle." He wasn't being cruel. That was the particular difficulty with Garrett. He said accurate things in a tone that made them hard to dismiss. Same as it ever was. He looked at me evenly. "I don't know this woman, but I know that single women in their mid-30s don't give up every Saturday afternoon to help a man build a deck because they enjoy carpentry. She's there because she wants to be there. The question is whether you're going to have the courage to not disappear when you figure out what that actually means." I said something dismissive. He nodded like he'd expected exactly that. "Here's the real thing," he said. He leaned forward slightly. Your problem has never been that you don't know how to care about someone. Your problem is that you don't believe you're the kind of person who gets to be cared about in return. Every time something starts to feel like it might actually work, you find the exit before it has a chance to fail on its own. You don't let it fail, you leave first, so you don't have to find out. That deck that's been sitting half-built in your backyard for 2 years, I guarantee you it's not because you've been too busy. You're afraid of what you'll feel when there's nothing left to build toward. Finishing something means you have to live in it, and living in something means it can be taken away. I sat with that for a few seconds. That's a lot of analysis for someone who hasn't seen me in 9 months, I said. I've known you for 15 years, Daniel. I don't need 9 months, I need 12 minutes. I drove home without saying much more. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. I looked at the kitchen window from the outside. The light was on. It looked like a house someone lived in. I wasn't sure when that had started to feel like enough. She came the next Saturday like always, same time, same easy walk up the driveway, and I told her I was buried in a commission deadline, couldn't work on the deck this week. She said okay, no argument, no reading of my face, no asking what had shifted since last weekend when everything between us was still easy, just okay. And she walked back down the street. I stood at the door and watched her go, and the total absence of pressure from her, the way she never pushed, never extracted more than she was given, sat in my chest like something I was not sure I'd earned the right to receive. She texted that night. 3 words. You okay? I stared at my phone for 20 minutes. I turned the screen off. Turned it back on. Read the 3 words again. I typed, yeah, just swamped with a project. Sent it before I could think about it any longer. Turned the phone face down on the counter and left the kitchen. That week was one of the longer weeks I can remember. I worked on the commission, a built-in mudroom bench and storage unit for a family over in Cranston, and I did the work well because I always do the work well regardless of what else is happening. My hands don't know how to be distracted. But in the quiet hours in the workshop between pieces, I found myself replaying everything Garrett had said, not looking for the parts that were wrong, looking for the parts I could live with being true. The part about Sarah was mostly true. The part about always finding an exit before things got real, that was largely true. The part I kept returning to was the part about the deck, about finishing things, and then not knowing what to do in the space that follows. I'd thought of it as patience. All those months telling myself I was waiting for the right time, the right run of free days, the right season, but sitting in the workshop at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night with no particular reason to be there except that I didn't want to go upstairs, I started to wonder if patience and avoidance had been sharing the same face for a long time, and I just hadn't looked at them side by side. The next morning I looked out the window at the deck. 12 boards still missing from the far section, the remaining lumber stacked at the edge of the yard with the tarp loose at one corner, a stripe of wood starting to silver in the weather. I didn't go outside. I sat in the workshop with my coffee, and I kept turning the question over. Not the question about the deck. The other one. I was scared. That much was just true. It stumped true for a long time, probably, dressed up in different reasons for different years. The problem wasn't the fear. The problem was that I was managing it by pulling away from someone who had never given me a single reason to pull away. I was punishing the wrong person for a fear that had nothing to do with her. I woke up that Sunday at 6 in the morning. Earlier than usual, the room still gray, the light just beginning at the edge of the curtains. I lay there, and I went through it the way I go through a build problem, looking for the point where the logic broke, tracing the structure back to find what was holding wrong. Every time Callie had come over, I tried to be honest about it, not the version where I was careful and reasonable, the actual version. Not once had I invited her. I had been present and open and glad, but I hadn't once started the motion myself. She had found the reason each time. The drill under warranty, the board that needed a second set of hands, the rain that came without forecast, the tea she'd chosen from the shelf, the drawings she'd studied without correcting a single line. And that question, what do you want it to look like when it's done, asked, while her hand rested on my plans, and she waited for an answer that I gave about lumber and grain direction and railing style. She had asked me what I wanted. I had talked about the deck. I'd had the actual answer for weeks, maybe longer than weeks. I just hadn't been willing to say it out loud to myself, because saying it would make it real, and real things can be lost, and I have spent a long time being more afraid of losing things than I am willing to admit. I got up, didn't make coffee, went straight outside in the early quiet and pulled the lumber off the stack and set it on the ground and picked up the drill. The wood was cool in the morning air. The neighborhood was still. A robin was working at something persistent in the maple at the back fence. I started laying boards. My hands knew what to do even when the rest of me was still working through it. That's the thing about doing physical work for long enough. Your body carries the knowledge, so your mind can do something else. About 30 minutes in, I heard a door. Not mine. I kept going. I heard steps in the grass, quiet and unhurried. I didn't turn around right away. You started. Her voice. No accusation. No edge. Just a fact, stated warmly. I set the drill down and turned. She was standing at the edge of the yard in her jacket, holding 2 cups of coffee. She had walked over without being asked or texted or expected, same as every other time. Callie. I stopped. Then I kept going, because stopping again would only be another version of disappearing. I'm sorry about last week. I ran into an old friend, someone who has known me long enough to say things I'd rather not hear, and he said some things I needed to sit with. Some of them right. Some of them I'm still working through. And the way I handled all of it was to disappear on you without any explanation, without giving you any reason, without even a real answer to your text. That's not how I want to treat someone who has given up her Saturdays to be here. She walked across the yard and held out one of the cups. I took it. She held hers in both hands and looked at me without any hurry. What did your friend say? She asked. That I have a pattern of leaving before things get real. That I'm good at caring about something right up until the moment it might actually matter. And then I find the exit before that moment arrives. I looked at the coffee, then at her, and that the deck being unfinished for 2 years wasn't about being too busy. She looked at the deck, at the remaining lumber, at the unfinished section. Then she looked at me. He's not wrong. The yard was quiet for a moment. I said, that thing you said, then maybe you're the reason. Were you joking? She held her mug in both hands and looked at it briefly, the way a person does when they're deciding how honest to be. Then she looked up at me directly, and what was in her expression wasn't uncertainty, it was patience, the look of someone who has been waiting for the right moment, and recognized that this was it. I don't know exactly when it started, she said. Sometime in the spring, I think, maybe earlier. I just know that every time I found a reason to come over here, the reason I gave you was true. I wasn't inventing anything, but the reason wasn't the only reason. There was one underneath it that I didn't name. She paused. I didn't think you were ready to hear it named. She held my gaze. The morning was very still around us. The robin in the maple had gone quiet. Somewhere far off, a car turned onto the block and drove slowly past. I wasn't, I said. I am now. She nodded once, small and certain. Okay, I said. The word came out quieter than I meant it to, but she didn't need volume. She understood it. I reached down and picked up the drill and held it out to her. The yellow and black handle, the familiar weight of it in my palm. Help me finish the last 12 boards? She looked at the drill for just a second. Then she reached out with both hands and took it the way she always took it, easy, like it belonged there. We got back to work. We finished the last board on a Thursday in late August, just before 4, when the sun had dropped to the flat golden angle where everything it touches looks like a photograph of itself. Callie stood up and brushed her knees off and looked at the whole thing, the finished length and width of it, the new railing, the grain running clean and straight. It looks better than the drawing, she said. 11 years I've been doing this work. That was the best compliment I've received. I went inside and came back with 2 cold beers. We sat on the finished deck with our backs against the railing, shoulders a few inches apart, and didn't say much for about 15 minutes. The air was carrying the smell of someone cutting their grass a few houses over. A screen door opened somewhere and closed. I didn't want to stand up. I hadn't not wanted an afternoon to end like that in a very long time. It was a new feeling, or an old one I'd forgotten so completely it felt new. In September I built her a bookshelf. She hadn't asked for it. I'd been over to her house a few times by then, always, with something that made practical sense. A borrowed level, a question about load-bearing for a commission, once, just coffee because I was passing, and it seemed like the natural thing to do, and every time I came inside, her books were on the floor. Organized, clearly, but on the floor. Careful piles by the wall, by the window, along the base of the couch. The kind of organized that says, I haven't let myself settle in all the way yet. I built the shelf over 2 evenings in the workshop. Cedar, simple lines, nothing that would call attention to itself. I left it outside her front door before she was up on a Friday morning. I tucked a note under the front edge of it. For the temporary floor library. She texted me that evening. It's not temporary anymore. Thank you. I read that 3 times before I put my phone down. October brought the first real dinner. Not coffee standing in the workshop or beer on the deck, a real dinner. The kind where someone cooks and the other person brings wine, and you sit at a table and eat slowly. She cooked salmon with roasted vegetables. Simple, good. I finished everything on my plate. I looked at hers about half left. She didn't say anything. She just slid her plate across the table toward me. I ate the rest. That was the moment. Not a declaration, not a turning point with music behind it. A plate of salmon pushed across a table in a quiet kitchen in October. I knew. November in Providence has a cold that comes in off the water and works through every gap in your coat and your collar and the space between your shoulder blades. We'd had dinner at a small place on Thayer Street and were walking the 6 blocks back, not hurrying. She had on a jacket that was 1 layer too thin for that particular evening. I wasn't thinking about it deliberately. I just moved my hand over and placed it over hers. She didn't pull away. We walked the rest of the block without speaking. Her hand was warmer than I'd expected. We turned onto her street and kept going in the same direction, at the same pace, and I thought, this is the thing I kept stepping back from, this quiet alongside someone. This warmth that doesn't ask you to explain it. I'd been afraid of this for years, and now that I was in it, I could not understand what exactly I had been afraid of. The first snow of the season came in January. She was in the workshop with me late, sitting across the work table while we went over the drawings for a bunk bed commission 2 brothers, 7 and 9, and the parents had given me specifications that required some structural math before I could feel comfortable with the joinery choices. We'd been at it for a while, 2 mugs of coffee gone cold on the bench between us. At some point, we both looked up at the same moment, and the clock said 11:15, and outside the windows the yard was white under 4 inches of new snow, and it was still coming down steady. You should stay, I said. Practical, nothing more. She looked at the windows for a moment. At the snow. Okay, she said. I went to the closet and pulled out blankets and started arranging them on the couch. I was tucking the corner in when she said my name. Quietly, just the one word. I turned. She was looking at me in a way that wasn't about the couch, or the blankets, or the snow. It was a direct look. Patient and clear. I set the blankets down. I slept that night through until 6 without waking. No restlessness, no 3 in the morning awareness of the ceiling. Just sleep. The kind that means something inside you has stopped bracing. In March, Garrett texted, "Heard you're seeing the engineer next door. You good?" I typed, "Better than good. Thanks, man." Sent it. Set the phone down. I looked out the window at the deck. Callie was sitting out there with her coffee, both hands around the mug, looking across the yard in the morning light. She didn't know I was watching. She was just there, unhurried, at ease on something we'd built together board by board over the course of a long summer. I stood at the window for a while before I went out, not because I was uncertain about anything, because I wanted to hold the moment as it was, before it became part of what had already passed. That same week, I came into the workshop one morning and found the DeWalt on the work table. She'd let herself in the way she sometimes did when I was still getting dressed. There was a note tucked under it in her handwriting, small and level. Returning to the owner. I bought my own. It's blue. Uglier, but it's mine. I picked up the note and read it again. And then I laughed. Alone in the workshop in the early morning, I laughed, and it was the first time I'd looked at that drill and felt nothing but lightness. No unfinished promises to myself. No inventory of things I'd meant to do. Just a tool on a table and a note, and someone a few steps away who had gone out and bought herself a blue one and wanted me to know it. I used to believe love was supposed to announce itself, that there would be a moment you could point to something clear and solid, something with enough weight to it that you'd know for certain you weren't inventing it. A declaration, a scene with an obvious before and after. What I know now is that it didn't arrive that way for me. It came as a loaf of zucchini bread wrapped in brown paper. As 3 hours of quiet work on a Saturday afternoon when the silence didn't ask anything of me, as a cup of tea made from someone else's forgotten packet, as a drawing studied without correction, as a plate of salmon pushed across a table without a word, as a hand that stayed warm against mine in the November cold and didn't pull away, and as a joke that wasn't a joke. She knew before I did, I'm certain of that. She came each time with a real reason, and every one of those reasons was true. But underneath the true reason there was one reason more. I just needed longer to hear it. I have always needed longer to hear things. The DeWalt is still on my workbench. Callie has her blue one uglier, she says. And she's right, but it's hers. On weekends we work out on the deck side by side. Her drill and mine running at their own pace, fixing whatever the next small thing is that needs doing. The deck has been finished for months. There is always something. A post that wants a new bolt. A board at the edge that swelled in the winter wet. Something one of us notices and neither of us minds fixing. We are people who find things to repair and then repair them. I do it with wood and plans and the tools I've carried for 11 years. She does it with patience, and with showing up, and with a note tucked under a drill on a workbench for a man who needed one more morning to understand that he was worth the trouble. Have you ever understood that someone cared about you only after you'd almost walked away, because you were afraid of what it meant? And if you were Callie, would you have had the patience to keep coming back, to keep finding the real reason that was also the other reason, until the door finally opened from the inside? If Daniel's story stayed with you, if any part of it felt like something you've lived, or something you're still living right now, hit like so. This reaches the people who need to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And leave a comment below. When do you think Callie actually knew? Was it that first morning when she asked about the truck wheels? Or did it take a little longer than that?